we do know what we're doing, don't worry. So first of all, thank you all for coming. I'm sorry for the delay. We had real-time circumstances for Akil, who was on his way over from New Haven, and there was a car accident, and he made 2 car accidents. I hope not yours. Okay. So we are dealing with some real-time circumstances, and I appreciate your patience. I also thank you for coming out, and both here in person and over the vast Zoom universe. And I can tell you how thrilled I am to be here. I'm actually missing the Rays Red Sox playoff game at the moment, which is tough for me. But even more importantly, my son, Ben, is pitching his first game of college baseball out at Oberlin College in Ohio today. He pitched 1 inning, because each pitcher given 1 inning, he struck out the side. So I just want to and I'm here, so here I am. So I'm going to introduce our panel. So to my far left is Brenda McKinley. She is the director of the Ridgefield Library. She has been since 2017. She came to Ridgefield from Serenius, is that I pronounced the first name correctly? Serenius H. Booth Library in Newtown, Connecticut, where she served as library director. Brenda also worked at the Yale University Medical Library, and the Danbury Public Library, and the New Fairfield Public Library. And we're grateful that she's joined us on the panel today. There's a lot of First Amendment issues that have to do with libraries, as it turns out. Something may surprise you. To my right is Nadine Strozen. I'm glad that Nadine's back. We've done this before, and she was a terrific hit, as she is everywhere she goes, I know. She's written, taught, and advocated extensively in the areas of constitutional law and civil liberties, including through frequent media interviews. In 1991 to 2008, she served as president of the American Civil Liberties Union. Professor Strozen is currently a member of the ACLU's National Advisory Council, as well as the advisory boards of Electronic Privacy Information Center and the National Coalition Against Censorship. We're dealing with a lot of electronic issues, I think, in today's discussion, so I'm particularly happy for Nadine's expertise. Her 2018 book, 8, Why We Should Resist It with Free Speech, Not Censorship, has been widely praised by ideological diverse experts. So thank you, Nadine. To my far right is Mike McIntyre, a local, just like myself, an investigative reporter, author, and editor. He joined the New York Times in 2003. He's produced in-depth stories on a wide range of subjects, including presidential politics, terrorism, and Wall Street bailouts. During the 2020 campaign, Mike, along with colleagues Russ Buettner and Sue Craig, obtained and published Donald Trump's long-concealed tax returns, a journalistic coup that earned the George Polk Daniel Pearl and Scripps Howard Award. So thank you, Mike, for coming to the panel. And to my left is my very good friend Akil Lamar. You know him well. He was here a few weeks ago. We actually put a cottage around the corner here for him. He's going to be moving in, I think. Akil has, at my invitation, been here a number of times. It's always a big success. I'm always thrilled to bring him before you, because he's one of my favorite people, in addition to being one of my favorite constitutional experts. Akil is a Sterling Professor of Law and Political Science at Yale University, where he teaches constitutional law both at Yale College and Yale Law School. Amar's work has won awards from both the American Bar Association and the Federalist Society. He's been cited by the Supreme Court justices in more than 40 cases. His latest book is The Words That Made Us, America's Constitutional Conversation, 1760 to 1840. Part of a 3-part series, is that right? And one of the interesting aspects of that is that it looks at the Constitution from the point of view of the popular press and the role that the press played both in the writing of the Constitution and in the development of the Constitution over the history of the Republic. So the first volume's out. Akil has copies in his trunk, as every author does. I have copies of their books in the trunk. Maybe every author has a copy of Akil's books in their trunk. And he would be delighted to sign copies for those who would like to purchase one at the end of the event today. My mic is not on. I have such a big voice. I'm not sure. Is that any better?
I don't know. I feel okay. Good. All right. So however everyone can hear me, and for those at home who didn't hear all that, it was terrific. It was absolutely fabulous. So behind me you have the panel for the that starts our event, but I'm going to try to switch it here.
Point it that way.
Point it that way. Okay.
Yeah.
Did it do anything? No.
No.
How's that? That worked? No.
No.
Maybe if I realize switch, just point directly at it. No. Okay. First thing I want to point out to everybody before we get started is that the Nobel Peace Prize was awarded this week to Maria Ressa and Dmitry, just pronounced Ridgefield. Am I right, Mike? So important because journalism is under threat around the world today. And I just wanted to read to you what the Nobel Committee wrote in granting this award. It said the Norwegian Nobel Committee has decided to award the Nobel Prize for 2021 to Maria Ressa and Dmitry Muratov for their efforts to safeguard freedom of expression, which is a precondition for democracy and lasting peace. Ms. Ressa and Mr. Muratov are receiving the Peace Prize for their courageous fight for freedom of expression in the Philippines and in Russia. At the same time, they are representatives of all journalists who stand up for this ideal in a world in which democracy and freedom of the press face increasingly adverse conditions. Normally that might sound like boilerplate language. It's not boilerplate language in the world that we live in today. And I think I pause, as you may have noticed, on the phrase that says, which is a precondition for democracy and lasting peace, because I believe it is. And so the award this year has a double significance for the work of these two people, and also because of the work of all journalists around the world. Mike, you actually know both of these winners, right?
Somewhat. I got to know Maria through a teaching fellowship that both of us had done at Princeton a few years ago, and I benefited having a really good dinner conversation with her and talking to her about some of these same issues that kind of brings us together today. And I also worked with Dimitri's news organization called Novaya Gazeta, which does investigate reporting in Russia, if you can imagine that. They have had 6 journalists, I believe, murdered over the years in Russia for doing the kind of reporting that we take for granted here in this country. And so meeting people like Maria and working with Dimitri's news organization is really a kind of humbling experience. I mean, I think that we have a lot to be proud of as journalists in America, but we don't face the kind of existential threats that Maria does in the Philippines and that Dimitri's staff does in Russia in terms of constant risk of being incarcerated or worse. And so when we consider what the value of the First Amendment is, all you have to do is think about what it's like to work where they work and do the kind of journalism that we do here every day without fear of being killed or jailed.
I was just reflecting on the fact that the first time I went to the Philippines many years ago, it was on behalf of Human Rights Watch, because there was an epidemic of people in my profession performing similar work, namely human rights lawyers who were being murdered. And so again, the rule of law, which is essential to maintaining the First Amendment as a reality, also is something that we should not take for granted. And I think it doesn't mean in either case that we should downplay the significance of the attacks on both journalism and the rule of law in our country. Yes, it could be much worse, but if we don't maintain eternal vigilance, it will get much worse.
And I want to add to that there's, journalism is the only profession mentioned in the Constitution. And that's significant. because it shows the degree to which the founders felt it played a role for it. And if we are going to reach back and cut through our history, as I think Americans tend to do, founders are incredibly important to Americans. We fight over them every day. It's important to remember that as we go forward. Anyway, Nobel Prize to courageous people. Tell me again what to do here. There we go. No, I took it out. There we go. All right, this is the language of the First Amendment, and I think it's always important just to explain ourselves a bit as we enter into these discussions. So Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or of the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. I wonder how many of you can name the 5 protections of the First Amendment. I intend to do that before I put this up here, but now I hope you can. They are so important to us, and I think it's remarkable when you see fully how few Americans actually do that. About the First Amendment. We're actually going to cut our purview down to just these things. Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or the press. There's so much else to get into, and I don't need to minimize the importance of protecting assembly or protecting the freedom of free exercise of religion or respecting the establishment of religion. Those are key elements of the First Amendment, but there's so much to cover. When I sent out an email a couple of days ago to this panel saying these are things I wanted to cover, and I approached the subject, well, somebody may want to speak about assembly or about religion. Nadine immediately wrote back and said, no, there's so much else to cover. We're just going to be so involved with what we have to do here that we don't need to extend it any further. Also,
But I did say audience members have a question
Yes.
about the others. We would be happy to entertain them.
yes, and we will get to a question and answer session on this. I also want to just give you a preview in terms of what kind of things we hope to cover today, or at least touch on. And so I made this little collage just so that you can see it. Up in the upper left-hand corner says CDA 230 refers to the Communications Decency Act of 1996, and Section 230 of it. If you want to impress people at your next party, you can say, let's all discuss Section 230. And I'm sure you get some nods. But it's actually a very important thing to discuss with respect to internet speech. It protects internet service providers from the speech done by third-party content producers, and it has had a tremendous impact upon free speech in America, both negative and positive, I think you could argue. Another area of our concern will be that over here on the left, we see that Alito responds to critics of the Supreme Court's shadow docket, particularly a story done in an Atlantic magazine, which is right to the right of that. It says the lie about the Supreme Court everyone pretends to believe. An attack on the Supreme Court as being an overly partisan institution and using the shadow docket, meaning cases that it determines that it will hear or not hear, as a way of influencing Supreme Court jurisprudence. And it was unusual for a Supreme Court justice to actually come out and criticize a member of the press. He actually did by pointing out the particular piece that we're talking about. I want to get from my panelists some sense of what they feel about that kind of interjection of the Supreme Court justice into the conversation. On the upper right-hand corner, you see Justice Clarence Thomas calls for reconsideration of landmark libel ruling. The libel ruling is called Sullivan versus the New York Times. How many of you are familiar with that case? So we'll discuss that a little bit. It has to do with the establishment of the libel standard for public figures, and has come under attack both from members of the Supreme Court very recently, particularly Thomas, but also a little bit from Neil Gorsuch. But his biggest attack came from President Trump, who wants to be able to reverse the libel judgment of Sullivan to allow more opportunities for public figures to sue for defamation. Right now, there's a lot of protection that allows for this dialogue in the press. On the bottom, you see a very recent case that came before the state court in Texas, I believe it was, when Alex Jones was held liable in the Sandy Hook by the Sandy Hook families for the defamation case. So we see defamation being cases being brought against some of the more conspiratorial speech that is out there on the internet. And then in the middle, you'll see there just Dr. Seuss. You'll wonder what's Dr. Seuss doing on a panel for the First Amendment, but there have been attempts to remove Dr. Seuss's early work from the libraries because of racist caricatures that were part of his early work. And the question then comes, when should libraries actually remove material when demanded by the public? Or is that the same thing as banning books? And we'll discuss that in some way. So I want to begin by asking Nadine, to my left here, what we have a State of the Union every year, where the president gets up and gives the Congress, the American people, an idea of where the country stands, the health of the country in general. I'm wondering what the health of the First Amendment is, and if you could speak to that. What is the state of the First Amendment?
Especially in a library, I think it's very appropriate to begin my answer by quoting the famous opening line of Charles Dickens' A Tale of Two Cities. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. And that to me is a perfect summary of the state of, not so much the First Amendment, but if I can broaden it, the state of free speech. Because the First Amendment free speech jurisprudence of these justices, aside from the criticisms we get from Clarence Thomas about defamation and so forth, basically this Supreme Court, all across the broad ideological spectrum of the justices, is very strongly protective of free speech. They consistently uphold freedom to engage in the most controversial speech, including hateful speech, including disinformation, including extremist speech. In fact, they get a lot of criticism from the public for sometimes being too speech protective. And it's not to say that government does not violate free speech rights. It does. The ACLU is kept very busy defending rights of peaceful protesters, journalists who are trying to cover peaceful protests, legal observers who are observing peaceful protests, who are getting arrested and detained and harassed without justification. That's happened in too many cities around the country. But we win those cases because the First Amendment law is on our side. So by and large, the state of legal protection, legal free speech rights is very, very good. It can be improved, but it's very good. On the other hand, if you look at the state of free speech in terms of people's actual exercise of their theoretical right to engage in free speech, it is not very good. Every public opinion survey that comes out, it seems about one a week. There was one last week from the Freedom Forum, but they all consistently show that all of us are massively self-censoring. And it's particularly distressing that this is happening on college and university campuses, places where one would expect the flourishing of free speech to be the most robust. And what's particularly disturbing is that people, and this is all across the ideological spectrum, all across age, other demographic groups are all pretty much equally represented in these self-censored populations. People are saying that they fear to talk about the most sensitive and the most important subjects, race being number one, gender being another one. Not for fear that the government is going to punish them, but for fear that they will be subject to what is often called canceling. I know that's a debated term, but to intimidation, harassment, ostracization, stigmatization by their peers. So if we really are going to have meaningful First Amendment, we need not only meaningful free speech, we need not only legal protections, but we need cultural support.
That's right, Tim. I would add to that also, as a professor at Mount Holyoke, I've seen this in spades. We have students who will come to me and say that they say something in my office, they would not say in class. I'll say, why don't you bring that up in class? It's not, oh, I don't want my other fellow students to criticize them. It's a kind of orthodoxy that they feel they may breach if they say something in front of the others. And it's a shame because you see that as sort of fundamental to First Amendment principles. The other thing that you see in Nagoya, let's say, if you have so many foreign students, is that Chinese students are fearful in a different way because they now in the age of the internet see themselves as saying something that could potentially be referred to the Chinese government, either through a post in social media or some other method, and will often therefore inhibit what they're saying for different reasons. But just as germane, we realize that the First Amendment is not just a domestic issue in some respects, it's an international issue as well. Do you see any of this at Yale in your work there?
Sure, and I think I agree with just about every single thing that you all have said. I might add one wrinkle that there may be a relationship between the very robust legal freedoms, which are more robust in courts than at any other time in American history, and our cultural lack of a really healthy speech ecosystem. Freedom of speech isn't just the freedom to speak, it's the freedom to listen, maybe even the duty to listen. At its best, it's about a respectful constitutional culture, which you can't legislate. But here's the connection between them. Part of the reason some people are intimidated is that others actually do have a right, a legal right, to be really coarse and mean and crude. So I just pulled up, I don't tweet, but I just pulled up on Twitter. So this is the top, when you put in my name, and our friend will confirm this. The top tweet is, screw you, Akila Marx, it doesn't use the word screw.
Does not use the word screw.
Okay, this is by someone I don't think I've
More
ever,
coarse than that.
I don't think I've ever met this person. It happens to be a graduate of, I think, Yale College and at Georgetown Law School, shame on him. And what he's offended by, apparently, this was, he just posted this on September 2nd of this year, 2 op-eds, interestingly enough, that I wrote over the years in a place called the New York Times, since we're talking about New York Times and Sullivan. One was what Gorsuch has in common with liberals, which I said, oh, you know, originalism isn't inherently conservative, Hugo Black was a great originalist, and he was a big champion of the freedom of speech. And I agreed with Adam Serwood, you hadn't written yet. I said, most justices, most of the time, do vote in line with the president who appointed them, but not all everywhere. So if you actually read the piece, I actually still pretty proud of it. And then another one was a liberal's case for Brett Kavanaugh, because I wrote this piece in the New York Times saying, oh, my side lost the presidential election, my side lost the Senate. I would have preferred Merrick Garland, but this was before Christine Blasey Ford. I said, well, I thought Brett Kavanaugh's as good as you're going to get from that side of the aisle. And actually, there are others on that list. I think so it was, I would say, I was trying to seriously contribute to public discourse to try to reach across the aisle, see if I have anything in common with Neil Gorsuch, whom I've never met. With Brett Kavanaugh, who frankly I don't know that well, but I'm saying, you know, we're Americans, we have things in common. There's common ground. There's law. But because there's such robust free speech, you can have extremists and just trying to shut down. I would say even reasonable folks who are trying to cross the line. I see my friend Nicholas here. We met at this last thing. He may vote differently than I do on certain things, but we formed a friendship. You know, after our experience.
They're going to the movies afterwards.
so we traded emails back and forth, and that's, so freedom of speech is actually, it's a system, it's an ecosystem, you can't mandate it, but at its best, it's about a duty to listen and a duty to respectfully engage people who disagree with you.
I would add one thing to that, and then I want to ask Mike something particularly. I would add that it's not only that is the duty to listen. It's the willingness to be changed by what you hear. Because if you don't approach it constructively, if you just say, yes, I'll listen to you, but your ideas are going to bang off of me and bounce away, then we don't have a constructive form of speech. But and that leads me to this question, I think for Mike, which is, a lot of speech, the notion of hate speech is that it ceases to be communicative, right? It ends up being like conduct. It begins, it's like an assault or something, that it loses a communicative value. We are in an era where there's not only coarse tweets coming towards law professors, but also towards reporters. Now, you have taken on many, in your work, many controversial issues, I'm sure, and published most recently with respect to some of the reporting you've done of Donald Trump. Things are extremely inflammatory to within the public dialogue. Have you received responses that are constructive, or have you found yourself the target of a lot of them?
Well, I think the short answer is the target of a lot of them. But a lot of that kind of goes with the territory of doing investigative reporting. And as you know, as a journalist, again, not everybody likes what you write, and you're going to hear from them. I think what's new now is that you hear from them, in a public way, whereas in the past you get a phone call or an email, more of a personal thing. But now it's just sort of blows up on social media, and one thing leads to another. But to put it in the context of the First Amendment of free speech, I can give you, kind of a real life example, since we brought it up about the issue of covering Trump, of the value of the First Amendment. As I think it was mentioned in the introduction, I was fortunate to be one of a team that disclosed President Trump's tax returns that he had refused to release last year. And it was as you might imagine, a pretty, long running project to accomplish that. And it was happening during COVID. And so we were, meeting remotely through encrypted meetings to kind of pursue this project. At one point early on, our lawyer at the New York Times, David McCraw, great First Amendment attorney, met with us and to tell us what the legal issues were involved and what we were about to do. And he said, well, I have good news and bad news. And the bad news was that normally if you're a journalist and you obtain something that's leaked by somebody, the leaker may face potential criminal exposure, but not you as a journalist. That's sort of a basic principle of press law, is that if you're the passive recipient of something, it could be national security secrets, it could be something similar, the leaker, if they violated the law in doing that, may be in serious trouble, but you won't be. You can be able to write under the Constitution to publish it as news, with one exception. This was the bad news: tax returns. There is a poorly written law which makes it not only a crime to leak the details of someone's personal tax returns, but also to possess and publish them. So we were fully prepared to have the FBI show up at our doors at home before dawn, which is typically how they do it, to kind of catch you off guard, and face potential criminal prosecution, not just individually, but as a company. And when you hear that, you say, well, what's the good news? And David said, well, the good news is it's never been tested, this law, and it's almost certainly unconstitutional. And in fact, nothing did happen. Here I am today. There was no criminal prosecution. But that, to my mind, like really in a concrete, personal way, reminded me of the value of what we have in this country. It's so different than what you would have in the Philippines or Russia, about the people we were just talking about. In those countries, there's just that onerous law, and not the constitutional protection to provide insulation to you as a journalist. I would just say one other thing about, in the context of what was being discussed a second ago, in terms of the climate of speech. It's been kind of a cliche over the last 5 years to say that we're in a perilous moment. But we're in a perilous moment when it comes to, I think, the First Amendment. And I look at it this way. I'm going to just present something to you, which is not something you may often hear in this context. We were talking about this before we came in. I got my start in journalism at the Ridgefield Press and the Little Bulletin newspapers, little papers right here in our community 36, 37 years ago. Sadly, I don't recognize them today. There's hardly anything left. The Ridgefield Press has no office in town, as far as I know. There's one young reporter doing the best she can from Danbury. I worked at the Hartford Courant for 10 years, and at its peak, there were 400 journalists in that news department. Now there's 30. That's the biggest, used to be the second biggest newspaper in New England. The reason I bring this up is I think that Americans have become disengaged in their relationship with the press on a local level. Typically, surveys in the past would always say, well, you'd have people say, oh, I have abstract disdain for the media, but they like their local newspaper. Much in the same way people hate Congress, but they like their local congressman. But in too many cities and towns today, there are no local newspapers. People don't have that relationship or appreciation for the role of the press. And so all that's left is this sort of like macro level feelings about the media in general. And what this does is it creates, to my mind, an opening for bad faith partisans and ideologues operating at a very high level to try to undermine freedom of the press. Because there is no pushback anymore. They don't have to worry about, a grassroots, objection to this idea. And I think, as the years go on and we head toward the 2024 election, this concerns me a lot. I think that when you mentioned the Supreme Court justices were kind of like making rumblings about maybe rolling back New York Times versus Sullivan. There's a reason why it's happening now, and I think that danger is just going to get worse.
Something it ties in with the point that you made as well, Todd, about the connection, vital connection between a robust, not only a free press, but a robust press and democracy, which is there's such a correlation between the absence of local news coverage and higher taxes, higher corruption. Government can get away with doing a bad job when the press isn't there as a local press isn't there as a watchdog.
Yeah, accountability, of course, is one of the primary roles of government that press plays with respect to government. And without somebody there to watch, it's sort of human nature. We're going to start seeing more corruption at the local level. I would add, though, that one of the reasons why we're seeing the local press retreat or be diminished is because so many fewer people are getting information from the local press as well. And I have two sons who were in their 20s, and although they read the New York Times and more than reads 5 newspapers because he's actually a journalist himself, but he bemoans the fact that his colleagues they get their news from Facebook, Twitter, from Instagram, from places that where the most communication they got on any story is a couple of lines and then a bunch of chatter associated with it. We have a real issue with that. I mean, most of the people in this room are of a certain age, I might say. Where are the young people that are interested in this subject, interested in what we're doing? Where's the young attachment to the First Amendment? It's a serious question. Brenda, I want to bring you in because I think you're probably seeing that all of these issues percolate in a very different way, but in the role that the library plays, both as an archive of information, but also as a kind of community center. I mean, and could you speak to that?
Thank you. All of this comes together in the library as a place where many people don't think of it in this way, but the First Amendment protects your right to receive information, and that's where we come in. And it's so interesting when Mike brings up the issue of the local press. I noticed that so acutely in the last couple of budget go-rounds here in town, once Mac Reed retired, and we didn't have that coverage of every single, and I kept looking myself because I'm following it for my own budget and everything. But what we're seeing in libraries, as far as I always feel fortunate being a librarian in New England, we don't get tons of censorship push from the public that a lot of our library colleagues do in other parts of the country. But one thing I have noticed in the last year is pushback on programmings, and those hot button issues where you might be hearing push on critical race theory. And when we're doing a whole program, we've been doing it for a while now on understanding race. Anytime we put something back, I will have a whole handful of angry emails in my inbox. Why are you doing this? I'm like, well, the programs are full. It's what the parents want. We do what, what our community wants us to do. And as far as the books, we do. What happens a lot here is we may not get that overt censorship, but we will see things disappear. And it is someone, kind of protecting. And these books that you mentioned specifically, actually Nadine and I emailed a little bit about it. And when the Seuss estate decided to stop publishing those books, like quite frankly, they don't circulate. They're old, they're not great. There's so much fantastic children's literature that people who are coming to the library are checking out. But what libraries were seeing is if you did have it on the shelf, you weren't gonna have it for long because people were stealing them because suddenly they were valuable. But of course, our approach to it is we were not gonna take them off the shelf. We continue to make them available. We move them so that we, could not have them stolen, but it is interesting. And I feel that the dynamic I can't even say it, through the generations of librarians has changed. My understanding as a librarian for 30 years of what censorship and my role is very different than what I see my young staff.
But it raises an interesting question, Brenda, which is, you said a minute ago, in response to someone who objected to one of your programs, well, the room is full, the tickets have been, people registered for it. That's what the public wants, in a sense. But what if what the public wants is not something? I'll give you a perfect example. I mean, very famous line from William Jennings Bryan during this ghost trial said, "The hand that writes the checks should rule the school," meaning that evolution should not be taught because the people in the community don't believe in evolution. What do you do when the community is demanding something that is illiberal in the sense of not wanting to contribute to our kind of community understanding about various issues?
I think that what libraries have responded to that through years. There are certainly libraries that totally cave and just absolutely, again, we're an association library. We are supported in part by our town and in part by our donors. And so we have a little more leeway. But I would also say that there's ways around it. The recent talk by Jamie LaRoe, who for many, many years ran the Office for Intellectual Freedom at the American Library Association, gave the example of a librarian out in Montana who was invited a Muslim cleric and faced this was at the height of early when we were in Afghanistan. But kind of stood her ground and approached it with more information and more opening and really reaching out to the people that actually did want to be at that program and wound up having hundreds of people there and being thanked for doing it. You just have to keep doing it.
It takes courage.
It takes courage.
Akil, I wonder if you could give the audience a little primer on Sullivan, what the case was and the standard that it established for the press.
It was a case from Alabama in the 1960s. The New York Times ran an ad from various civil rights leaders who were trying to draw attention to the civil rights cause. The ad was entitled "Heed Their Rising Voices," and it was trying to solicit money for folks like Dr. Martin Luther King, Reverend Dr. King. And the ad appeared in the New York Times, and it had certain factual mistakes that were quite small. It described a police crackdown and said that the police had ringed the campus. They hadn't quite encircled it 360 degrees. The protesters sang the national anthem. They actually sang "My Country 'Tis of Thee." I believe there were fewer than 250 copies, maybe fewer than 50, Nadine will know the number, of the New York Times actually sold in the entire state of Alabama. It did not mention any any person by name for specific criticism, but it basically criticized Alabama officialdom in general, the establishment that was suppressing the free speech, the civil rights movement. A suit was brought in state court suing the New York Times for libel. Massive punitive damages were sought and were awarded. Basically, so much that the New York Times was at serious risk of being bankrupted by the threat of this kind of litigation. Would have to shut down coverage of a national movement if this lawsuit and lawsuits like it had been allowed to go through. The issues were a little complicated at the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court, in a ringing opinion in the early 1960s, 1964 or so, said Alabama can't do this. The First Amendment, which says Congress shall make no law, of course, had been held earlier, and rightly so, to apply against states and localities. The 14th Amendment says no state shall make or enforce any law which will abridge fundamental rights. Note that the echo of language, the First Amendment says Congress shall make no law abridging freedom of speech and press, shall make no law abridge. Well, now the 14th Amendment comes on and says no state shall make or enforce any law which will abridge, shall make no law abridge. And states, of course, include cities and municipalities, counties, and the like. So,
And Sullivan was the police chief, right? So that's made him an actual civic official.
And so he sued the New York Times. The New York Times lost. So on appeal, the U.S. Supreme in the state court system, the U.S. Supreme Court's New York Times versus Sullivan. At trial, was Sullivan versus the New York Times. And the landmark ruling by the Warren Court was that, especially when, well, there were 5 different ways of protecting the press. One, people shouldn't be allowed to sue and to prevail unless they're specifically mentioned. So this is the other concerning test. Just mere criticism of government in general shouldn't allow individual government officials to bring a lawsuit. That even if there are you should never be held liable for mere opinion. And even if there are factual mistakes when it came to, in this case, public officials, this is going to be broad to public figures more generally, and that's part of what Justice Thomas is going to ask about. Well, public officials maybe shouldn't be able to clamp down on criticism of them, but what about people who aren't public officials? What about someone, for example, comes to public attention because she was a rape victim or a murder victim, the family of Gabby? Should they actually have the same diminished ability to bring a lawsuit that the families in Sandy Hook? Should they have, because it's an issue of national public interest, should they have the same sort of diminished ability to recover as, let's say, a government official? Now, surely, I would say you have to go get public officials, to at least people running for office, choosing to run for office. But the New York Times opinion says basically that intentional falsehood isn't fully protected, although, as Nadine mentioned today, the Supreme Court is close to protecting almost intentional falsehood in that case. A person claimed that he received, that he was a war hero when he wasn't. You apparently have the right to lie about your own credentials. If you don't libel someone else, libel laws are a little different. But if we're intentionally false, that would be one thing. But if it's not intentionally false, there are going to be misstatements that inadvertently creep into any legitimate public discourse. My country tis of thee versus the Star Spangled Banner, and ringing the campus versus almost ringing the campus, and the like. So unless the falsehood was basically intentional, or the press really didn't care whether it was intentional, it was the standard is called actual malice. It was basically if the press evinced a reckless disregard for the truth. They didn't even try that to fact check it in any way. Libel law would be limited. Now, one final thing. Justice Thomas thinks some of those rules maybe are too generous to the press. But maybe a different resolution of all that if we focus on a different part of the equation. So maybe actually people about whom falsehoods have been uttered should be able to recover at least their reputation by going to court and having a judge and a jury say, this was false, getting a declaratory judgment of truth, and they could win back some of their reputation. Maybe that's part of the problem was the massive punitive damages. Maybe actually we should have the kind of actually crushing liability that was at issue in that case. In New York Times versus Sullivan, basically state courts had three what were called galloping presumptions. They presumed that something that was critical, derogatory, was false. They presumed it was intentional and malicious, and they presumed it was highly injurious. In fact, Sullivan's vote, support in the community, given that it was a lot of white voters in Birmingham, Alabama, went up because he was criticized by the New York Times and he suffered no real reputational harm in his community. But that's in a nutshell the backdrop of the New York Times story.
I always thought it was fascinating that case revolved around an advertising. You'd like to think it was some piece of crusading journalism that resulted in this foundational, piece of litigation, but it didn't. It was just something involving an ad that had erroneous information.
But I speaks to the fact that you're a reporter. So how often do you get things wrong? And how much in the course of rushing to, I'm not calling your reputation, but how often you get things wrong as a reporter's rushing to get something out?
Well, I mean, if you look, we all make mistakes. I've had corrections on stories before. And if you consider what the New York Times, to take that as an example of what they publish every day, and the equivalent of just textual information, it's probably equal to several books, being published every single day, 365 days a year. You're gonna have errors, especially the kind that you were talking about in terms of that advertisement. And you bring up a good point, because I think one of the things that we want to talk about a little bit is like, what does it mean today to be a journalist? What does it mean to produce news? Because this sort of gets at part of the concern in terms of what Americans are digesting on social media and how much of that they consider to be news versus what I would consider to be just garbage. If you look at the work of actual journalists versus the work of this entire subculture that exists out there, people who basically take the work of actual journalists, actual reporting, and curate it and twist it and slice it and dice it and pontificate about it, bloviate about it, and present it in a way that basically forms some preconceived ideological and partisan narrative and call themselves journalists. There's a lot of people like that. And part of the reason why they might do that is several. One is that being called a journalist, at least to their mind, conveys some sense of authority or credibility. There's also a bit of a legal protection that comes with that. If you're a blogger or someone online and you claim to be a journalist, you have access to information perhaps, or legal protections that actual journalists do. I would argue that to get to your issue of mistakes, if you want to judge what's a real news organization versus one that isn't, look at how they handle their errors. I mean, can you think of another profession where every single day they openly acknowledge and publicize their mistakes and correct them, like most newspapers do? I mean, for most businesses, that goes against the whole model of what they do. I mean, they would do anything but admit an error, which could result in, a decline in market value or open them up to liability or whatever. Newspapers do this every single day. Hopefully they're not serious mistakes, but we correct our errors, we acknowledge them, because what a real news organization is doing is they're trying to get at some fact-based truth. They're trying to present reality. And of course, everybody has, biases they bring to bear and this, but look around and when you see certain cable news outlets or digital news outlets, news, I put in quotation marks, that never ever admit that they're wrong, never admit a mistake, then I think you can begin to differentiate who is the real journalist and who isn't. Unfortunately, I think a lot of Americans don't care. 6 years ago, I think the big concern was grandma on the internet not really knowing how it works, seeing things on Facebook or getting emails that might lead her to believe that the Pope endorsed Donald Trump, which of course didn't happen. Today, I think it's less that than it is people who willingly indulge in this stuff, because it's something about human nature which kind of leads us to kind of want an affirmation that what we think and what we feel, what our prejudices are, is okay, and other people think the way we do. And it's like eating junk food. You get a sugar rush initially, but then the more you consume it, the less healthy it is for you. And so when you're online and you're just consuming all this stuff on Facebook or Twitter or whatever, you get a dopamine spritz, because that affirms what you really believe about whatever, about Black Lives Matter or name something, or COVID. And I really feel, this may be an unpopular position, but I really feel like the internet's been with us for a quarter century now. We all kind of basically understand how it works. I think that for people who continue to kind of wallow in this stuff, that's where they want to be. And I'm not sure what you do about that. It's no longer a question of like fact checking. We can fact check stuff till the cows come home, but a lot of people just don't care. But that's not why they're reading this stuff. They're reading it because they want to.
I'm glad that Todd segued to disinformation. I know we're going to continue to talk about that, because I think we really, when we consider, and I realize you were not advocating censoring so-called disinformation or misinformation, but many people are, including on social media. And I think it's really important to go back to the historic lessons of New York Times versus Sullivan, which Akil laid out in such fascinating detail, that the Supreme Court there was not defending lies per se or mistakes per se. It just said, I can't do justice to the exact quote from which I believe came from James Madison in the opinion, that some degree of abuse is inevitable in the use of every power, including freedom of the press. And we've decided that we would rather err in favor of not unduly chilling free press, because if you're going to have vigorous discussion of these fast-breaking controversies, you can't pause to dot every I or cross every T, or you'll never get the information out. So rather than allowing punitive responses that actually did shut down national coverage of the civil rights movement for about a year, because this particular lawsuit was part of a systemic campaign of multiple lawsuits that were being brought against the New York Times and other national media, which were the lifeblood for the civil rights movement, which depended on national attention and national financing to fuel its movement and ultimately lead toward the great civil rights statutes. So, I think we have to be very concerned about the problems that Mike is talking about, but in terms of solutions, I think we have to look at education and critical media studies and media literacy, civics education, getting people to the library, and recognize that if we empower government to censor disinformation, more loosely construed, than the narrow constraints of Times versus Sullivan or fraud or perjury or some other recognized legal categories. Predictably, government is going to use that power and abuse that power to silence its critics and those who are advocating for reform, as happened in the Sullivan case.
Meaning, Brennan, I'm sorry, I remember the decision, but I mean, the Sullivan decision was written, when Brennan wrote that decision, it was the time of newspapers and television, essentially the evening news, which often followed the print press in terms of its choice of subjects. And there was, in each case, some time built in to a pause from the moment of the reporting to the actual pushing of the button for the thing to appear. We live in an era now that is so much quicker due to the electronic means that we have now. This has changed the First Amendment, or has it changed the First Amendment? I guess that's the better question. In your understanding of the way the media landscape has changed over the past quarter century, as Mike pointed out that the internet has been with us, and as news has shifted into social media, how do we understand the Sullivan decision now, and does it need to be adjusted for the new times?
I don't think that it needs to be adjusted specifically because of changes in the media landscape. And if you go back through human history, every time there's been a new medium of communication that inevitably makes it cheaper, faster, easier to reach, to disseminate more ideas to more people. There is, some people, some of us get very excited and other people get very fearful. And, even the transition from oral speech to writing was strongly criticized. And of course, the printing press, we know the revolt against that. In my lifetime, I've seen, well, not quite in my lifetime, but in the century in which I was born, I know that there were attacks on radio and TV and the telegraph and even the phonograph in the 19th century. So to me, this is the same old, that you look back and you say, the fears of greater dangers inherently posed by other media were exaggerated. These are all media. That means they transmit what we individuals put out there and have an impact on those individuals who are on the receiving end. That's what we have to deal with. We have to educate people to, to do their own fact checking, to use the virtues of the internet. Never before has it been so easy to do your own research, to see multiple sources, to go to the original source. Don't take anybody else's word for it. Go to the original. Subscribe to newsletters.
So it's faster to get misinformation out. It's easy to get misinformation out fast. It's also faster to correct stuff. It's on both sides. And Nadine, I think, put her finger on one of the key phrases in New York Times Sullivan, that we don't want to have a chilling effect on legitimate discourse, especially criticism of government and government officialdom. The other famous phrase, the opinion, that I think still very much rings true for me, is that the specific rules were crafted against the backdrop of a national commitment to a robust, uninhibited, wide open public discourse that actually the court admitted was going to be sometimes going to be coarse, sharp-elbowed, and welcome to America. But the problem, I think, I'm with Nadine, the problem is individuals are choosing to eat junk food rather than to have a healthy diet. And at a certain level, the government can't prevent them from doing that, but it can have libraries and programs and schools and PBS and all sorts of things. And a legacy press is under a lot of economic that people can choose if they want to actually credit, because the New York Times has more of a reputation for reliability than One News America. But that's why you have to be an informed consumer here just as when you're buying a house or buying a car, or buying a baby food.
Well, I feel like I should say that I'm not favoring government intervention in this. But it's also worth pointing out that when we do talk about the First Amendment, there's no constitutional right to have a Twitter account. You know, there's a constitutional right to have the government not shut down your Twitter account because it doesn't like what you're saying. But a lot of what's happening here that we're talking about, you know, in terms of the disinformation and propaganda that's spreading around, the people that are kind of either consciously or otherwise wallowing in, it is all taking place in a private ecosystem. It's all being managed by social media giants that only really unless until they're shamed into or you know into taking some sort of action does anything really happen. And that complicates things. And that is where things are different than they were when Sullivan.
And of course, there's the issue when bigness becomes tantamount to government too, right? When private sector becomes so big that it becomes institutional in a sense, and we end up with a different set of circumstances. I want to, Nate, I want to bring you back to discuss section 230, because if you could explain it to the audience and give us, because I know we talked about Sullivan and the desire for a robust dialogue, as Akil said, and that it might be coarse, but it's become much coarser than I'm sure than William Brennan ever would have anticipated, or any of his fellow justices on the court at that time. And one of the reasons is because the internet has opened up so many avenues for both anonymous speech and speech that is sort of cordoned off from libel protection. And I wonder if you could speak to section 230, explain what it is and what its effect has been on the public dialogue.
Sure, I'd be happy to do that, Todd. But before, I just want to have a little parenthetical nod to a prior appearance I was privileged to make here. And one of the other panelists was a historian at the University of Connecticut. I'm sorry, I'm not going to remember her name, but she had historical examples from the founding era and the Civil War era and all these other halcyon eras where the language was so coarse and so vile and so obstreperous. And of course, there was actually even violence taking place in the halls of Congress. So I'm at least going to register.
Well, Adams and Payne had carried on quite a vigorous, insulting dialogue that has been recorded to some depth.
So sometimes I think we tend to have historical hubris. Never has it been so bad before. And I'm just going to be a little bit, reserve that for further discussion. But what section 230 did was passed by huge bipartisan margins just when Congress was becoming aware of the internet. This was in 1995. It had been aware, the scientific community had been familiar with the internet before that, but it started hitting the public and political and media radar screen in the early 1990s. And Congress, of course, passed a law that mostly censored patently offensive and indecent expression, which the ACLU was able to get struck down. But there was one section of that statute, which we all refer to as section 230, which the ACLU and other, the American Library Association and other free speech champions supported, which was designed to maximize the internet's potential as an opportunity for an unprecedented opportunity for every single one of us to potentially communicate with every single other person in the entire world. And, to get beyond the strict, so here's the downside. It's good to have gatekeepers who are sorting the wheat from the chaff and screening out the garbage, but to get through the gatekeepers at the traditional media was very, very hard or very, very expensive. And very, very few people had that privilege and that opportunity. So I just want to remind people, I think we tend to take for granted the enormous positive impact of the internet. We tend to focus only on the downsides. Think of all the social justice movements that, as an example that might appeal to progressives or liberals. There are many on the other side of the spectrum as well. But, you know, Black Lives Matter and Me Too, these movements would never have taken off and succeeded the way they did without the internet. So to maximize the opportunity of third parties to use internet platforms, Section 230 was designed to give an incentive to platforms to allow open dialogue and discourse without feeling that they had to vet every single thing that was put up there. That would bring us back to very strict gatekeeping and deprive the internet of its potential. And so basically 230 has two sides to the coin. One is that online platforms will not be liable. There are a few exceptions, but in general will not be liable for third-party content. That is, one of us goes onto the platform and we post something that happens to be illegal. Let's assume that it happens to be defamatory. It satisfies the Sullivan standard. The platform is not going to be liable for that. So they don't have to screen. They can just say, welcome everybody, post your messages there. The other side of the coin, though, is there was an effort to encourage the platforms to impose their own content moderation standards, as Mike was alluding to. So they could decide, for example, that we want to have a family-friendly platform. We want one that's not going to involve pornography, because that might be unappealing to a lot of people, or might not involve brutal violence because that might deter people. They could create the whatever they chose, exercising their First Amendment rights, right, to serve as editors, and they would not, by virtue of engaging in some screening, therefore take on the responsibility for unscreened material. So I think it was really designed to be the best of both worlds, to honor the First Amendment rights of the platforms to engage in some content moderation and curation for the benefit of participants in their online communities, but also to encourage them to allow a robust flourishing of information and ideas. And I think some little tweaks have been proposed to that basic concept that I think are probably okay, but I really oppose any significant or wholesale gutting of it.
But there has been pushback, right? And could you describe that for the audience?
The pushback to me is really remarkable, because basically whatever anybody dislikes about social media, they blame Section 230 and say we should get rid of it. Case in point, Donald Trump and Joe Biden during the presidential campaign were criticizing social media for exactly diametrically opposite reasons, right? Trump complained that conservatives were being disproportionately suppressed and thrown off social media, and Biden was complaining that social media were allowing too much, you know, extremist speech and hate speech and disinformation. But what did they agree on? They both said we have to get rid of Section 230. So I think there's a lot of, you know, uninformed scapegoating of Section 230.
I want to leave some time for questions, but we have one big territory I want to get to before we do, and that's with Brenda. And that has to do with the interesting developments for libraries with respect to books. Attacks from both the left and the right in terms of content and in programming as well. We alluded to this a little bit earlier, but also with respect to just the kinds of issues that libraries are facing now with guerrilla attempts to sort of intervene and, as you said before, steal books or deface books that they find objectionable, and how libraries are responding to that.
You know, it is interesting. A very famous case that's just actually in the news right now is a book that was, I think, originally published in, it was like 2015, right? It's called George, and about a transgender girl who actually becomes Melissa. And popular book, it's been out for a while, circulates well, and the author, who is transgender herself, realized through the years that actually calling the name George really wasn't the right title. It should have been called Melissa's Story, because George was Melissa, and that was what, you know, it's to honor who Melissa was. That's what the book should have been titled. And this came through understanding a number of years, and this push came out for people to change the title of the book. And the author actually, you know, it's one thing for individual to go ahead and change their own title on their own copy, but the author is asking libraries to go in and change, like actually do what was being called Sharpie activism and change the title on the book. But of course, you know, when we talked a little bit about your right to receive information, the importance in a democracy for people to be informed, back in the 30s, the American Library Association established our professional ethics, your Library Bill of Rights. And there's been tons of interpretation and thought around this area. And there's a bunch of things that libraries don't do. And we don't abridge. We don't censor, we don't rate, we don't label. We give you the information and we respect you to make your decisions for yourself. And, you know, when I was talking about the differences in some of the professional through the generations, I see that I've been a librarian here in Connecticut for 30 years. It's been a long time. I see younger librarians really ready to just plow right in and say, no, we have to do this for the right reason. Like, you know, for me, the right reason is if that book needs a new title, I don't question that at all. Republish the book, we'll buy it, we'll put it on the shelf with a new title, but we're not going to go in and we're going to change it. So it is interesting because I see that coming from within also, and maybe it's a different understanding of what these principles mean.
Also, you spoke, before we began today, you spoke to the issue that's arising where people want to see the library respond to popular issues in terms of canceling out someone who has become the target of Me Too investigation. You could speak to that.
I think it's that is actually specifically addressed when libraries really dig deep into our professional ethics, that you know, all views, we don't look back into someone's life, and that it is tough. I mean, there are so many books that are on reflection based on our standards today and how we understand the world around us that are a problem. But they're part of our history, they're part of, you know.
I was speaking specifically, though, you mentioned earlier that Bill Cosby's books, for instance, you've been asked to remove from the, not because of the content of the book in that case, but because of the reputation.
I think we not only see that in libraries, we see that in the movie industry and all kinds of, but I think expecting your artists and your authors to live up to that standard, it becomes a real problem. That is what you said earlier.
This difference there, though, it seems to be between preferring to go to the movies of someone or read their books, or asking the library to remove the books because they're offensive.
I mean, it's not, yeah.
Go ahead, Phil, you go ahead. I'll ask.
I was just gonna say, newspapers come out every day and they can correct their mistakes.
Yes.
And now online, every minute, they can update. So here's how I actually struggle with this, because it's so disheartening when I realized I made a mistake in the book, in my book. And it's out there in the world now. You know, I can tell my publisher, maybe in this next edition, you can fix the thing. Here's what I've done. And I haven't finished this project yet, but a friend of mine helped me create a website, gilmar.com. We have errata for my most recent book, and eventually I'm going to put the errata for all my previous books. I actually have post-its in all my previous books, my own copy. Every time I see a mistake, I sort of note it. And I think eventually this will be the state of the art. Actually, I think every author, living author, should try to actually correct his or her errors. And I did one thing. Okay, this is being recorded, but okay. It was a library book. I know I'm never supposed to deface a library.
Uh-oh,
But I put a post-it in the library's copy, because it was actually something that was factually incorrect. And I thought, I really am an expert on this. This actually is incorrect. And so I put a little post-it in the margin, correction, and you can open it up and someone can rip it out if they want, but I actually put a
Was it your
correction.
book? Was it your
No,
book?
no, it was someone else's book, a library book, but it wasn't a permanent defacement, and so now, was that a horrible thing to do, or was that actually helpful to the next reader as part of a scholarly community?
Interactive browsing is what I would call it. It's not that.
I would say that's, mild compared to what we see, but, like that ultimate question though, of going and pulling something off the shelf, like it just comes down to like, you can't decide that for someone else. That's ultimately where the library puts the line in the sand. And it's a conversation with a parent about a kid. There's often really controversial topics, especially in young adult literature. But that is where the librarian is here to help, to guide, to direct you, maybe to hear from a reader that, hey, you know what, this topic should be updated. Maybe this book, is outdated. We do have really strict policies about what we buy, why we buy it, and why it comes off the shelf. There's reasons why some do, but not because someone is going to decide that for someone else.
What you should have done is like photographed the error and then gone on Twitter and trolled the author.
Some sort of ideological, they're just mistakes, typos, and all the rest. The author is long dead, and it's a valuable source. So I was actually trying to make the book more usable for the next reader, but maybe I crossed a line.
Let's see if do we have any questions at all? Okay, so let's start with the ones that are here in the room. The gentleman here in the checked red shirt there, if you could stand and
Is it on?
yeah.
Okay. Thank you. I've been to 3 of the 4 sessions and they've been fascinating. But tonight is the first time that I've heard the media mentioned, which I think is an important element because there's a radical change in our media today than there was 30 years ago. And that's what I would like to get back to. There are 2 things that happened at the end of last century. The fairness doctrine, which Ronald Reagan put out, I think around 1988, and 1995, 230. They basically took the government out of regulation of television, which it had been a very strong advocate of before that. I was on Madison Avenue in the 60s and 70s, buying network television, and there was a continuity department. You had to put your ad in to get approval. And there were certain kinds of products you couldn't put on air. There was all kinds of rules and regulations they had, which was proper because television was just developing. It's called the golden age because it was free. I think we all remember that. But it changed, and it didn't change for the better because now it's completely muddled. And yes, everybody can get into the internet, but so can the Russians, so can the Chinese, so can the Iranians. Everybody can, and it's too much. And we are being hacked and ransomed. And so there's.
What's your question, sir?
Well, to the panel, what influence do you feel the lack of government regulation has done to today's world?
Sure. One of my friends who is a libertarian as opposed to a civil libertarian, but I like this comment he made. He said, there's no problem. I believe there's no problem that's so bad that government regulation can't make it worse. Now, I don't have that extreme of view, and I've supported many government regulations. I've mentioned a couple, the civil rights statutes being among them. But the fairness doctrine is something that no matter how benign the title sounds, I'm not aware of any study that's been done of the fairness doctrine that says that it actually promoted fairness. The standards were so vague and gave so much discretionary power to the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC. That power was predictably used in politically partisan ways. And studies that have been done showing this not only infamously in the Nixon administration, but in the Kennedy administration, Democrats and Republicans alike used this very vague standards to go after media outlets that were critical of them and their policies. Worse yet, because one aspect of the fairness doctrine required so-called balanced treatment of any controversial topic, it had an unintended, I believe that I know and admire Minow and other original crafters of the fairness doctrine. I think they really did have good intentions. So they intended balanced coverage. But in fact, what happened was it was so expensive and burdensome to have to provide, quote, the other side, that studies document that the networks backed away from covering controversial issues at all.
I disagree. Can I get back?
Quick comment, then we need to move on to another question. Go
Yeah,
ahead.
well, the first thing I can say about our today's world, it's okay here. But the Nobel Peace Prize winner Maria was on CNN this morning and talking about her country, the Philippines, and there's only two sources of news for the election coming up this November: Facebook and some other. I'm not sure what the other was. But would you like to rely on that kind of news channel? I mean, that's where you can be. We're not there, but I mean, it's international, it's global at this point. So where are we headed?
I just very briefly, I think you and I will agree on a lot of the problems, but I respectfully disagree that more government regulation is going to be a solution to the problem, especially in the Philippines. The last thing you want is the government is not going to create more media diversity, right?
I'm with Nadine, but one of the regulations that I think she would be in favor of would be antitrust. And so if there are only two information providers, it's like if there are only two automobile companies or two of anything, that's an antitrust problem. It's a special problem when it's antitrust of information flow. But at the end of the day, you know, freedom's a bitch, okay? And if Americans are determined to piss away everything, they can do it. And it only takes probably 3 or 4 elections for that to happen. And then actually the entire Supreme Court even turns around. So courts aren't going to save you. And government, well-regulated, well-intentioned government regulation can't save us from ourselves. There are rights, but there are also responsibilities. And that's why it's not just freedom to speak, it's freedom of speech, it's the freedom to listen, the duty to listen, and the duty ultimately to pay attention to the common good and treat this the same way you would treat anything important in your life, like whether, you know, which house to buy, what school to send your kids to, what job to take, what church to attend or not. So at the end of the day, this is the Federalist 55, that a Republican government of, by, and for the people presupposes public virtue, widespread, more than any other system of government. And by virtue, it actually means the ability of each of us to actually take responsibility for our information flows. And if we don't do that, we're doomed.
More questions? We're going to go back to one coming from our.
Yep, we have from online. And I'd like to thank the 30 folks who joined us online this evening. I have a question. Will the panel be discussing recent incidents of municipal officials and police hostility towards video recording of police and governmental officials in and from public property? And these are also known as First Amendment audits.
Well, who wants to take that one? I don't know enough about this stuff.
I love it when actually people are using their, I mean, look, Nadine says like everyone can actually be a journalist today, and now that's a problem in a way because some people are crappy journalists, but it is extraordinary that anyone can upload something and actually, you know, this, you know, is extraordinary. So if I see police misconduct, I can record it. And then upload it. If I knew how to do these things, I'd actually have to ask one of my 3 kids. And in half an hour, it could go all around the world and maybe stop the thing if it was a bad thing from happening. There are some issues about privacy violations if you're going into people's houses or the like. But I think actually there is a right to record and to publicize police misconduct that you happen to see.
Yeah, I'm a little unclear exactly what the
Yeah, I was too. I was, what I thought the question was about. Yeah.
But in general, I mean, it's something I've encountered as a journalist over the years is that it can be difficult dealing with the authorities at scenes where you should, as a journalist, have access to be able to know what's going on and how something is being handled. So I think I totally agree. I mean, this is an area where the web has been a good thing because of the ability of people to record history as it's happening, which is not always a good in a good way. It's like the George Floyd case is a perfect example. If not for the video of that, I don't know what the outcome of that whole case would have been. And that's repeated over and over again so many times. I do just kind of quickly say something on the flip side, because part of my role here, I think, is being the doomsayer, apparently. In some ways, I do think things are worse than they ever were. The Andrew Jackson campaign, notwithstanding. Several years ago, we did an investigation of President Trump's use of Twitter. And when you first launch into something like that, you kind of think, well, this seems frivolous. But then when you really get into it, you see, oh my God, this is what ramifications are. This is the flip side, the benefits of people using access to the web in a way that helps civic discourse and allows justice. What we found in examining the president's unprecedented use of the social media network were, basically the Russians, the Chinese, the Iranians, the gentleman mentioned earlier, intelligence services targeting the president's news feed, in other words, stuff that he would see during the day through fake accounts. Twitter every day is trying to take these down, but it's basically a cosmic game of whack-a-mole. Never do it. And so you had a combination of hateful stuff being tweeted at the president by white supremacists and anti-Semites and racists, QAnon conspiracy nuts, and foreign intelligence services flooding through his iPhone every single day. And he would sometimes dip into it and retweet stuff, some of this toxic junk. And that is unprecedented. And that, to my mind, in a nutshell, kind of sums up where we're at and how it's different than the past. I mean, when you have that ability to potentially influence public affairs through the highest office in the land, and you're sitting in some, either your basement someplace or an intelligence bunker in Tehran, I don't know what you do about that. I don't favor government regulation, but it feels like something has to change.
Yes, right here.
Sort of getting into what my question was, I think we're sort of whistling past the graveyard here as far as social media goes. I agree with our journalist friend that maybe antitrust is the way to go, because these media companies basically are countries they're taxing their citizens and they're giving them no sustenance. I think Kara Swisher has made this comment. They're like potentates who just take, and they supply nothing to their citizenry, and they're basically in scale countries. And China and Russia and the Philippines, all these countries, they're regulating social media, and social media is falling in line with whatever they say. But here, it's just a monster. It's taken over, and maybe it's not fairness doctrines or 230, but maybe it is some way to break up these companies or have them be a little more accountable.
I certainly agree that there are problems and something has to be done, but I would strongly disagree with the precedent of the regulations that other countries have been imposing. As you said, they are falling into line, but they're falling into line with the government's preferences. So whether you call it regulation on hate speech or extremist speech or disinformation, those very vague terms are used disproportionately to censor any critic of government policy, any dissident minority groups. So I think that's, again, agreeing about the problem. I disagree about the solution. I think antitrust is a potential solution. I think because I really believe in individual freedom of choice and maximizing that. I really wish that all of us individuals were entitled to, radically increase transparency about the policies that these companies are using. We know that we're subject to pervasive, unprecedented surveillance, even those of us who eschew using social media, we can't escape it. And then that's used by algorithms to apparently to curate content and to drive us, or to attempt to drive us in ways that we're not aware of. That's antithetical to individual freedom of choice. So I certainly favor at least the strong consideration, which is going on in Congress and state legislatures, of sort of privacy and notice and consent type requirements, sort of in the nature of the consumer protection. I also think, and here's what techies call interoperability, that these companies should be required to interoperate with others so that you could choose your own curation and content moderation and privacy settings that could be provided by other software providers. So these are, to me, positive avenues that are being explored seriously by Congress.
And I was just going to have a comment. As this gentleman here was saying, when fairness doctrine went away, then we saw the rise of people like Rush Limbaugh, who could go on hundreds of radio stations and provide hours of content, just whatever he felt like saying, and there was no counterbalance to it. And it was driven totally by money.
By people who wanted
It
to
was
listen
driven
to,
by
by people who wanted, by people who wanted to listen, and I actually am not on that side, but when Rachel Maddow tried to actually, have her radio network on the other side, there weren't as many people who wanted to listen. Okay, so at the end of the day, so we should let people vote because they're stupid. We should let them serve on juries because they don't know what they're talking about. And we should let them even on Twitter because they're morons. No, at the end of the day, a Republican government of, by, and for the people presupposes free will and agency and some of the stuff where it's transition. You can fool us once, but in the long run, democracy is a bet that the people, it's whack-a-mole, but in the long run, we're betting actually on people to make adjustments to their lifestyle and their information flows when they realize they've been hacked. And it may take, I wish more of them realized it a little quicker, but at the end of the day, Rush Limbaugh is allowed to actually, reach people who want to hear what Rush Limbaugh has to offer.
That was the good old days. Now we have trillion-dollar companies.
Let's get another question. I think we should get them on. Yes, right back there, the gentleman with the green. Yes, I think it's green.
And then we'll
I think so too.
I think it's on our.
Well, the vexing thing about social media is that it's created a revenue model and a profit model for falsehoods. And it seems to me that it is possible to regulate the profit model, that commercial form of business, and still keep channels open for positive communication, broad communication, research on the internet. Is there any reason why it is an improper form of regulation to say that social media and the big companies cannot sell for profit search histories and profiles when those are being used to disseminate falsehoods very broadly. Any reason why that is an appropriate form of commercial regulation?
I think you've collapsed two different things, which are falsehoods, which are not protected, and selling information that you may have acquired. That's not the same thing as a falsehood.
Section 230 protects dissemination. It protects the publishers. So these two things are conjoined. I've never heard anybody claim that they're not conjoined. I'm very surprised to hear you say that they're.
Well, you mentioned two things. You said, selling search information, and then you say disseminating falsehoods. Disseminating falsehoods is actually, it can be prohibited. You can sue, for example, whether you can sue the platform or not, you can sue the person who actually posted on the platform. And that's not the same as they're acquiring information about me. Those are two different things that you smush together. And the cesspool of Twitter, I don't tweet, okay?
So
but the cesspool,
so there's-
so hang on, you asked me, you said something, I get to respond, then you can respond, but right now, I want to tell people what my thought is on this, please, with all due respect, okay? So, I don't tweet, it's a cesspool. But when this fellow, whom I never even met before, says, F you, Professor Akhil Amar, and 838 people actually like it, this does not make my day, but it's not false, it's that guy's opinion. He's allowed to say, and Rush Limbaugh is allowed to say all sorts of stuff, and at the end of the day, voters have to decide what they're going to actually believe and what they won't.
If I can add something, the profit motive certainly animates the New York Times and other traditional media as well. Maybe they're not as successful in raking in the money as the other companies, but it's never delegitimized freedom of speech because the product is being sold.
And in fact, of the
Right,
5 freedoms, maybe 6, because you could distinguish possibly between free exercise and establishment. But most of them are inherently egalitarian in that freedom of assembly, each person has one body. Freedom of petition, each person has one signature on the petition. Free exercise, each person has one soul that you can take to this church or that one. Freedom of speech was originally freedom of speech and debate. The model was like a town meeting. If you think of Norman Rockwell's amazing depiction of freedom of speech, it's actually, there's a guy, he's got a leather jacket, he's a working class person, look at his hands, he's got a piece of paper rolled up in his pocket, and he's gonna talk and people are gonna listen to him. Maybe it's a pothole, maybe it's school board policy, but those are all.
Maybe it's section 230.
It's just like this, New England style, it's very egalitarian. The one thing that's least egalitarian, because actually the press, my friend Todd, thinks about it as the media, but I think at the founding, it was actually, the press wasn't an institution, an entity. It was the printing press. It was a machine, and very few people had it. It was actually it was monopolistically distributed. Very few people had this huge, big thing called a printing press. And I'm with Nadine in thinking, the end of the day, it's a tool, and my kids are using it as a toy, which annoys the hell out of me, okay? But at the end of the day, in every single person in the world, actually, with an iPhone or laptop or something, can participate, can be a Ben Franklin, can actually be a printer. Wow, I wouldn't want to let government shut that down.
Or they could be an insurrectionist. And what I can empathize, I think, or understand some of the trepidation that I'm hearing from people, because when you look at what happened on January 6th, it took almost an overthrow of the government before 2 of the big social media giants, Facebook and Twitter, took action they resisted taking for years, which is banning President Trump from both platforms. It took the president going online in Twitter. I know that, unfortunately, I do have to spend time on Twitter in the cesspool because of my job. It took the president of the United States going online and attacking his vice president while a mob was seeking to kill him in an erected gallows outside the Capitol. While it was actually happening, this is what the President of the United States did. He then tweeted his praise for the insurrectionists and said he loved them. After that, Twitter and Facebook, these two private companies, finally took action. So, I mean, I can't get, I keep coming back to this unprecedented moment. And when I started off earlier saying, as kind of a joke to say, this is a perilous moment. It is a perilous moment. It's unprecedented. And I fear where we're headed because
But if he had written a book and made $1 gazillion of it, said, I love these people, these are my people, they're patriots. God, I don't like that. I'm never Trumper. But if he's allowed to do that, at the end of the day, having seen all this, he could be the next president of the United States, and that's not in the end. Government can't and shouldn't try to shut that down. Ordinary citizens have to decide whether this is the sort of person they want to endorse, and actions are in fact subject to criminal sanction. So and certain words actually, when they come very close to action, certain incitements, the intentional and imminent urging of violence is not protected. Nadine is nodding her head because that's what they call Brandenburg versus Ohio, and hundreds of people have been indicted, and rightly so. And so at the end of the day, it's the very same technology that enables folks to actually gather to protest George Floyd or something, which I think is amazing.
We have time, we've already gone over half an hour, I think we should all see around here, but if we have, maybe just have one more
Go ahead,
question,
sir.
actually.
Yeah, go ahead.
And you're free to come up afterwards and speak to the panel.
Okay, just hold it up. so
Oh,
we can hear
sure. First of all, thank you for the discussion. This is, my wife and I actually just moved to the area and this is fantastic. So first of all, thank you very much for the panel. I'm just curious, earlier we were mentioning the picture of Justice Thomas. And I'm just curious what the panel thinks if the Supreme Court does eventually agree to reconsider New York Times versus Sullivan. New York Times versus Sullivan. Does the panel feel that if that does happen, that there's a certain aspect of the case that they would reconsider, whether it's the actual malice standard, how you define a public figure, how you define defamation or libel, or the affirmative defenses, or do you think that the Supreme Court might be inclined to just overrule the case altogether, which is kind of frightening to think about?
Now, on his facts, even Justice Thomas has admitted it's correctly decided. I do think that I don't think there are 5 votes, but I do think there might be 2 or 3 to think about the public figure, public official line. And on the public official sideline, you have to include people who are running for public office at the very least. And then what about their families and spouses? So it's going to be tricky, but so yes on that. But the compensating thing on the other side, and will maybe making it easier. You can have a bifurcated trial where, and judges have already done this. Judge Laval actually did this, where you do it in 2 steps. First, was it false? And then the jury comes back with that, and they actually, which is in effect a judicial declaration of truth. It provides more reputational remedy to someone who was slimed. And then second, was it malicious and all the rest? No, it wasn't. And so the press is spared from massive punitive damages, but the plaintiff actually gets some sort of reputational vindication. So there may be more regulation in a pro-press direction about the quantum of damages. Maybe, for example, make it much easier when there's an early retraction to say that cuts off punitive damages thereafter, all sorts of stuff like that. But that's my, in the weeds take. I don't know if Nadine disagrees.
I have no idea what the Supreme Court is likely to do, but like many years ago, I wrote a law review article about Sullivan, probably even before you were born, Akil. And it's exactly along the lines that you've talked about, and I was quoting experts, which did not yet then include you, but experts with very different perspectives coalesced that it would be better for both the press and plaintiffs if it could be focused simply on that question of truth, that plaintiffs, by and large, are not seeking damages. They want vindication that there was a lie that would hurt their reputation. And perversely, the press really doesn't like the Sullivan Standard from a practical point of view, because it puts front and center the question of what was the intent, what was the motive, what did they know, what was the research. And in discovery, they have to turn over all of the reporters' files and thought processes. And that's really damaging to their interests as well. So even if the Supreme Court did not change the law, I think it would be possible to come up with this kind of fix through legislation that would be mutually beneficial and still preserve robust freedom of press.
I want to thank you, Nadine, and Mike for being with us.
Also, let's thank Todd. Thank you, Todd, for all your great. Thank you all. If any, the library proper is closed, so if anyone's doing the elevator, please press MLR. That'll take you to the lobby.